The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. I don't know how many of you have ever had an opportunity to read this, but if you ever have the opportunity, let me suggest that you don't bother to read it. And the reason that you shouldn't read it is because it's so convincing. It really is. It is a totally evil document. It will tell you that, according to this, that the Jews are going to gain control of the gold of the world. The Jews are going to gain control of the educational system and dumb down the people who are not Jewish. They refer to them in this document as the Goyim. And that they are going to take over the entertainment. And they're going to destroy the morality of the people. And they are going to begin working towards this world socialist government. They're going to work within the Masons. It's a very, very convincing document because you'll see a lot of truth in it. The trouble is that it wasn't written by the learned elders of Zion. There are a number of books that go into this, and I recommend them to you if you're interested in documenting what I'm about to say. A book by Norman Cohn, Warrant for Genocide, and a series of books by James Webb, The Occult Conspiracy, The Occult Hierarchy, The Occult Underground, point out that the protocols were written by somebody associated with an organization known as Theosophy and smuggled into Russia, where they were translated into Russian. They were originally written in French, translated into Russian, and then, of course, circulated in Russia leading up to the pogroms. After the Russian Revolution, they went into Germany, and they became the basis of convincing many Germans that it was the Jews that were behind everything wrong in the world, which, of course, gave Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitic policies and the Holocaust a great deal of justification. But one of the more interesting parts of the protocols, the story of the protocol, centers around a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House. And I talked to you about him a little earlier, and I showed you the letter that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had written to him in November of 1933. Actually, when I went through Colonel House's papers at Yale back in 1980, on several occasions, I came across this. This is the protocols of the meetings of the Zionist men of wisdom. It is, for all intents and purposes, a copy of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, but it's different than any other translation because the wording is different, although the ideas are the same, the paragraphs are the same, the wording is different. It is a different translation than any that I know that's available in the West. And so where did it come from? I mean, the original one was in French, and of course then it went into Russian, translated into Russian, translated into English by a man named Victor Marsden, and circulated in America. And that is not this translation. This is a different translation. Now, Colonel House was very active in 1905 when this first went into Russia. Why did Colonel House leave this in his papers, knowing that someone in the future would find it and would comment on it? I've read a great deal about Colonel House. I've never once seen any mention of the fact that he left a copy of the protocols. He wrote a book in 1911. It was called Philip Drew Administrator. In that book, he laid out the plan for the establishment of a dictatorship in America using many of the ideas from the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. He wrote the book anonymously, and one of the things that he did was to leave a clue so that people would be able to figure out who wrote the book. But he would never admit that he was the author, at least until about 1920 or 21. He said, let's have a meeting at Mandell House. Well, his name was Edward Mandell House, so it was pretty clear who was actually had written the book. But he liked to do things like this. Colonel House had some very, very strange powers. He controlled the President of the United States. And people at that time were always curious, how was he able to control the President of the United States? A fascinating book, My First 83 Years in America, was written by Ambassador Gerard, who was the American ambassador to Germany during the Second World War. During the First World War. And Ambassador Gerard tells us that by 1915 the Germans wanted to end the war. You remember it started in 14 and went to 1918. But by 1915 the Germans, February 1915, they wanted to get this war over with. And of course it was accomplishing nothing. And so he was approached. He wrote to President Wilson and said, now's the time to enter negotiations. We can be the intermediary. We can bring peace, stop the war. And he doesn't get a letter back from the president. He gets a letter back from Colonel House that says, it's not time to stop the war. The British don't want to stop the war. And furthermore, all future correspondence between you and the president will come through me. And Ambassador Gerard writes in his book, I mean, where did this guy come up? Where did he come from? He was never elected. He was never appointed by the Senate. He has no standing at all, and yet he directs me that I can't contact the president who appointed me. I have to go through him. Colonel House and some of the books written at that time would go into a room and talk to people, and he'd maybe fix somebody and he'd begin talking to them, and after he had left, an idea would come into their mind, and that idea they'd think would be their own, and they'd begin acting on it, never realizing that it was Colonel House's idea. And the man who commented that never understood how this had come about. One of the more interesting things about Colonel House is his diary, and the reason I went to Yale is because I wanted to read his diary, and I had read all of the summaries of the diary, 4 volumes. I have the intimate papers of Colonel House written by Charles Seymour, but I was reading things that other people had written that had come from the diary that weren't included in what was available at that time for the diary in 1980. And so I went to Yale University and found out that the diary had been given to Yale in 1923. It had been covered a period from about, perhaps 1911 to 1923 on almost a daily basis. Colonel House kept this diary, and then he had a proviso that it would not be available for public scrutiny until 50 years had passed. So that was 1973, 1923, 1973 it would be available. Immediately it was bought up by Times Mirror Company and copyrighted so it could be published, and then never published. And to this very day, it's never been published. When I was there in 1923, they allowed me to copy it because they were sure that it was going to be available, and printed at any time. Although they were going to put it on microfiche, and I don't know how many books you've ever read on microfiche, which is little transparencies you flash up on a screen. But one of the fascinating stories that they told, and Colonel House writes this, he said, I had lunch with Clemenceau. Now, Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France. And this is about 1919 when they're working on the Treaty of Versailles. And Clemenceau was very worried about the communist revolution because the communists were saying, we are going to destroy the West, we're going to get revolutions in Europe, and we're going to overthrow capitalism. The communist leaders were saying this, Lenin was saying that. And so Clemenceau was saying, we better put these communists down before something happens. But Colonel House said and wrote, but I was able to convince Clemenceau that nothing could be done to put down the communists militarily. And then I had lunch with Orlando. He was the Prime Minister of Italy. And he had the same views. He wanted to do something about communism. I was able to convince him that we could do nothing about communism. And then he writes, I knew what I told them wasn't true. I knew with a small mercenary unit and a few battalions of artillery we could put down the communists, but I didn't want Clemenceau and Orlando to know that. Now, why would this man who was not a communist want communism to survive? It really, in many ways, doesn't make sense. And how was he able actually to convince these leaders of the world of something that wasn't true and that he knew wasn't true? How was he able to control both Woodrow Wilson, who said I would never make a decision without the advice of my good friend Colonel House, and President Roosevelt? How was he able to do it?